So when you approach a vertical jump with the horizontal velocity, and in order to convert that horizontal velocity upward, you need to apply a ground reaction force here from the point of contact in both a backward and upward direction. So in this case, the backward component of the ground reaction force is going to reduce your horizontal velocity, while the upward component, it's going to increase your vertical velocity, therefore achieving your objective here. So we can further analyze what this mechanically looks like by drawing a free body diagram, in which case we are just taking the center of mass of our body, which is a point in space that we can summarize individual distribution of masses from all of our body segments into one point. And that allows us to study the mechanics of the body very easy. So think back to high school physics class. So we draw here the center of mass, its horizontal velocity, as well as the ground reaction force from where it is applied. So in this case, we can clearly see that that ground reaction force applied in this sort of backward and upward direction, it is going to decelerate the center of mass from going very fast horizontally to going slower, and also accelerate the center of mass upward, right? So that's what you want. You want to jump up. So that covers the linear aspects of the movement. But what about the rotational aspect? As in, how would the ground reaction force impart a rotational effect on the body? So you can think of it like this. When you have a ground reaction force applied at an angle and the distance away from the center of mass, what's going to happen is that this normal component, or the component that is perpendicular to this line, this vector, it is going to impart a moment or a torque about the center of mass. So think about this. Imagine if this is the pivot of a door, and you apply a ground reaction force at a 90-degree angle, you're going to swing the door open, right? You're going to cause the door to rotate about the pivot. And similar effects is going to happen here. And this normal component is going to impart a moment or a torque about the center of mass. So in the case of the high jump, this is usually what they mean by the loss of balance or the out of control rotation, where the ground reaction force you apply to achieve the linear objective of the jump actually imparts a undesired rotational demand if you don't want to rotate your body. There are scenarios where you do want to rotate the body, and having your ground reaction force directed in such a manner is actually beneficial. Essentially, my baseball research for the past 2 years. So what could make it worse if you follow the blue markers for a faster approach velocity is that you might have a ground reaction force that's directed even more backward. Then this normal component is even longer and even greater, and this will impart a greater moment about the center of mass. So it's even harder to control the rotation of the body or remain in balance when you approach with a faster velocity. So essentially, when you are running and jumping, you have to wrestle with both the linear objective of decelerating your center of mass forward travel and increasing your center of mass vertical velocity, so jumping up, and also maintain the rotational objective, which is to minimize this moment about the center of mass while staying in balance. So you see that there is always going to be an angle and a distance away, and the distance part you can't really change, right? Because your center of mass is near your trunk, but it's always going to be your feet contacting the ground no matter what. So there's almost always going to be a distance component to this moment. So what you can do is to try to minimize this angle component by aligning your ground reaction force with what we refer to as the position vector. So if you imagine that the black pan is where the ground reaction force is oriented at, if you can make sure that your center of mass is positioned somewhere that's aligned with the ground reaction force, the angle becomes zero, and you will have a very small to almost zero moment about center of mass. That's because when you imagine pushing into the hinge of a door, right, you're not going to rotate the door. You're just literally pushing into the hinge. So there's only the linear aspects of that remaining. But when you deviate, then you're going to impart a moment or a rotation or a torque in either direction, depending on where the ground reaction force is oriented at. So in this case, John also talked about this in his most recent podcast, that people can in fact lower the center of mass. Obviously, this is exaggerated, but if you can lower your center of mass, that allows you to become more in line with the ground action force vector. So you still achieve this massive backward-oriented ground action force to decelerate you without imparting too much, without imparting a greater moment about the center of mass. So other the scenarios, this means that you need to come in and have the foot contact further in front of your center of mass, and also approach with a lowered stance. And obviously, this have implications on the positions your joints have to hit, right? You end up having a very, very sort of shallow angle to the ground, and you're gonna sort of contact with a very sort of plantar flexed heel. And that may or may not do something to the actual joint and the foot segment itself. That's not really my areas of expertise, but that's what can happen. So all in all, I just want to say that when you apply a ground reaction force, it's not only the linear part of the movement that we need to think about. It's also how the orientation and point of application of the ground action force might impart a rotational demand on the body, and therefore can lead to things like loss of balance and people feeling they cannot control their body, right? It's not your fault, it's just the ground action force is directed in such a way that imparts a mechanical effect on your body. So here's why studying biomechanics and ground action force and how it interacts with the body center mass position is extremely important when it comes to understanding the movements themselves.